Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 18 of Compliance Into the Weeds, a podcast with Tom Fox and Matt Kelly. Today is our first post-election podcast, and in this podcast, Matt and I take a look at some of the proposed or expected changes in policy implementations of President-elect Donald Trump in the area of SEC enforcement, the Securities and Exchange Commission, Dodd-Frank, and the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. At this point, there have been no public pronouncements by President-elect Trump on which direction he may go. However, he did have some comments during the election campaign, and with regard to the Fcpa, he's previously commented on the Fcpa. We take a look at that and take a look at what a Department of Justice might look like under a Trump administration. This is Tom Fox. Thank you very much for listening to this episode of Compliance Into the Weeds. A special post-election edition of Compliance Into the Weeds with my good friend and colleague, Matt Kelly. Matt, welcome.
Hello, Tom, from Cambridge, Massachusetts, where, of course, you can guess how we voted last night in the election and what the general mood is over here in our part of the country.
Indeed, and I can about the best thing I can say is it's over.
That is true.
But even with that being said, Matt, I think both you and I think that there may be some changes which will directly impact the compliance practitioner. And kudos to you because you got a post up on it today entitled 5 Post-Election Points for the CCO to Ponder. So I thought maybe we might take our listeners through some of our initial thoughts of things to at least consider or watch out for. So what do you see from your perspective?
Well, I think the most tangible problem that we'll encounter right away, and I think that the business community is going to encounter many different problems, uncertainties, pauses, whatever word you want to use, but we're going to encounter a lot of them for quite a while, is how they resolve staffing up the Securities and Exchange Commission. We need to remember right now there are only 3 commissioners because 2 nominees are penned up in the Senate, where Senate Democrats have put a hold on those 2 nominees advancing to confirmation. So we have only 3 people actually working as SEC commissioners, including Chairman Mary Jo White. What does she do come January 20th? Normally, as a Democratic appointee, she would resign and let President-elect Trump, which we all have to get used to saying that, but she would let Donald Trump appoint his own successor there. But will Democrats also filibuster that? Because if they do, then the Trump administration would kind of be in a tough bind because there would be only 2 sitting commissioners, and 2 sitting commissioners cannot do any actual business at the SEC other than kind of routine stuff, but they can take no votes. And I could easily see someone like Elizabeth Warren say something like, "What are you going to do, Mr. President? Not like me twice?" There's very little downside to certain powerful Democrats tying up the nomination process in knots, which really is what Republicans had done to the Obama administration for 8 years. We have some follow-on consequences from that. If we have no SEC chairman, that person is the one who nominates a new chair to the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board to oversee audit firms. The current PCAOB chairman, Jim Doty, is in an acting capacity. His formal term expired a year ago, and he's been doing this on an extended basis because Mary Jo White didn't want to make a change. She wanted to let the next person make a change with the new administration. Well, we don't know necessarily who that might be or when that person might take office, if at all, or if we're in paralysis, which means any leadership change at the PCAOB is hung up as well. Those are 2 of the very first things. One other point about the SEC. I have heard that so far, former SEC Commissioner Paul Atkins, who was a Republican nominee back in the Bush administration, he is apparently the transition team point man for all matters SEC and a few other independent agencies like that. So what will he want to do? What will his relationship be to Mike Piwowar, who is the current Republican commissioner on the SEC and might be the only Republican on January 20th if we can't get anybody else nominated? We don't know. But those are some of the dynamics just there, and we've got many other we could cover if we want.
So the political appointment process, I guess, I think that is, first of all, I think the Republicans will, we will not be able to filibuster. They will take the nuclear option away or engage in the nuclear option, and anything really now will, with 50 votes, will go through, including a Supreme Court justice. I think that'll be payback to Harry Reid. So my concern is they will ram through anybody they want. In terms of an actual SEC chairman, the Bush administration gutted the SEC with both lack of funding and, frankly, with a chairman in the end of their administration who did not want the SEC aggressively or even actively prosecuting cases. So you can demoralize a commission or an agency equally as strongly by putting a person in place who thinks everyone under him is either an idiot or an out-of-control regulator. So there's lots of different ways that that type of influence can point or not point towards enforcement. But certainly the naming of the commissioner and getting that formally in place will be a huge sign to the both the compliance community and, frankly, the business community on which way the SEC is going to go on enforcement. So that's going to be something that we really do need to watch. But also, before Wells Fargo, Matt, we had a fair amount of discussion about the CFPB and the, I believe, D.C. Court of Appeals ruling, which held that the single-person commissioner, rather than the five-person oversight commission, was not constitutional, so that we may have that agency, or I'm trying to say, before Wells Fargo, that agency was under some pressure, I think, from Congress on whether it would exist going forward after Wells Fargo, when both sides of the aisle were so upset in the political theater that we call Senate hearings. There may be a reason to save the CFPB. We'll just have to see on that one, but I think the Republicans dislike consumer protection even more than they dislike corporate protection.
Well, I do think that we might see some change to the leadership structure at the CFPB. First off, I think that it will become a position that serves at the pleasure of the president, which means that Richard Cordray, the current director, will probably be out of a job come January 20th or 21st. But will they actually manage to pass legislation that changes the structure to more of a bipartisan five-member commission like we see at the SEC and other agencies? I don't necessarily think that is a terrible idea. I do think that Richard Cordray has done a good job, and you are correct that Wells Fargo is a very nice feather in his cap, and we'll need to see what the fate of that is. It does get to the question of what other legislative reforms Congress might try to get, which I suspect will come from the House first, where the House does want to reform things like what you were saying. But it depends a lot on how quickly they can get things through early in the next term. We can talk about that, but the CFPB is another one that I suspect will see some change sometime next year.
Well, I think you pointed out in your blog post that really the Republican agenda in the House is largely going to be set by Paul Ryan, and my suspicion would be that if they didn't have those plans in place already, they will certainly have those plans in place by January 20, and that the House will move very quickly to repeal, obviously, Obamacare, but perhaps all or part of Dodd-Frank and other protections or legislations that were put in place by Obama and the Democratic administration. But, Matt, I'd like to turn to the Fcpa, as you
Sure.
I guess I've been thinking a lot about that today and where that might go. The Fcpa professor had a post today where he highlighted again, was reposting of information he had before, but nevertheless, it's significant because it turns out that President Trump, gosh, that's hard to say, had given public remarks on the Fcpa. on an interview with CNBC Squawk Box. And he said that, quote, "This country is absolutely crazy," end quote. Prosecute alleged FCPA violations in places like Mexico and China. And he said that the FCPA is, quote, "a horrible law and it should be changed," end quote, and that it puts you as businesses at, quote, "a huge disadvantage," end quote. So that's a pretty strong antipathy to the FCPA. And I would say that I've heard that from other business people as well, but what President Trump, I guess I can call him President-elect Trump, what President-elect Trump may not understand is, one, the success in prosecutions that the Department of Justice and SEC have had, how much revenues that's generated for the government in fines and penalties, but more importantly, how that law is part of a coterie of laws that are used to combat terrorism, because corruption has been directly tied to terrorism. And I don't think President-elect Trump has thought through that, or perhaps even has a nuanced view on such matters. So I don't think he will move to repeal the FCPA. I think the Chamber of Commerce has their compliance defense amendment ready to go, and they will go with that. But kind of piggybacking on a point you raised, Matt, the FCPA in the Department of Justice is prosecuted by a group in the fraud section, now headed by Dan Kahn. And it's a 20-person unit. And they just this year doubled the size from 10 to 20. They got expanded headcount. They got expanded funding. And those are things that are set by the budgetary process, both the Attorney General and in consultation with Congress. And the Attorney General can set priorities at his or her discretion. So a Attorney General may decide that's not a priority for his administration. That could be one way to impact FCPA enforcement. Another way could be to cut or slash funding to the FCPA unit and take it back to its 2015 size of 10 lawyers. It could be that the unit itself is disbanded. They could send the prosecutions out to the individual U.S. attorney's offices across the country instead of housing it in main justice. So there's a multiplicity of administrative acts that the Attorney General or the Attorney General staff could engage in that, frankly, President-elect Trump may not have thought about and may not think about. He may leave those decisions to his individual cabinet members, even with his obvious distaste for the FCPA.
I'd agree with pretty much all of what you just said. I also do think, what Donald Trump has said about the FCPA before, I don't believe he understands the law. I do believe that he confuses a lot of that and a lot of other things. I also, when he says this is the horrible law, frankly, Donald Trump has said that about every law in the books except for bankruptcy protection laws. So we do have to take that with a grain of salt. I do not believe we will amend the FCPA. I do not think compliance officers should believe the FCPA is going to go away. But like you said, this really is going to hinge on who the enforcers are, who's head of the fraud section, if it exists, what happens to the compliance counsel, Hui Chen. Is that a position that is going to remain? If it does, is she going to stay there? Certainly, but we don't know, you and I. So I am hard-pressed to, offer much there, except that, I think maybe, Donald Trump really hasn't met any enforcement action that he likes. So I don't see why FCPA enforcement really would, I don't think it's going to go away, but, I wouldn't be surprised if they start slow-rolling some of it. Although compliance officers should remember, now you've got plenty of other anti-bribery statutes around. So even if you are in favor of abolishing the FCPA, even if that happened, you still have the Bribery Act. You still have other anti-bribery statutes. You still have, even in the U.S., you've got the Travel Act and other ways that you can trip up with intermediary payments that are at the root of so many FCPA problems. So I think the dynamic of what you have to worry about, I don't think that's going to go away anytime soon.
And with the drive to make that a requirement of commercial contracts, whether that be lending contract from banks, private equity funding, whether it be business to business on straight commercial contracts between counterparties. We've seen, or I have certainly seen, the requirement for a best practices compliance program become a part of the commercial contracting discussion. I think that will continue as well. And you're absolutely correct on the increased enforcement across the globe. I expect you will write shortly about the new French law because you've been following it quite closely, and I think we had some information on that today. So increased enforcement across the globe is certainly will continue as well. The other thing that I really wanted to throw out to hash out with you, Matt, is the following. We have several large FCPA cases that are rumored to be in the mill. Walmart is the biggest. We had some information publicly released that the Department of Justice had floated a fine of $600 million, which Walmart had rejected. I say that by way of introduction that when there's an end of an administration or a change in administrations, there's a rush to settle cases, both from the DOJ side, so the lawyers who've done it can get the credit for that, but from the company side, because they have some certainty because they've been dealing with a lawyer or lawyers for perhaps several years. Will that dynamic take hold, or will it be the dynamic that perhaps companies say, screw you, we're not settling anything. We're just going to throw the dice with the new administration, and we're going to wait till 2017. Any thoughts on that?
You know, that is a good question. I have to admit, I hadn't really thought about it all that much. But I could see that, I could very well see that calculus entering into their thinking. As not only that, but you and I tend to talk about Fcpa because that's sort of the bread and butter of what compliance officers worry about. But, there's a whole realm of other labor and, wage and hour enforcement or National Labor Relation Board sort of enforcement actions out there that tie companies into knots. We could see very similar sort of patterns happen there as well. Short answer is, I don't know. I don't know what some of these companies might do, but I'm hard-pressed to believe that a lot of them would think we're going to get worse treatment in the first few months of a Trump administration, so we should pay up and settle now. I don't really see that, I don't know how many people are going to go wrong by betting that they can stall and run the clock out. It could happen.
And then, of course, Chris Christie may well turn out to be our next Attorney General, and whatever you may think of him with Bridgegate and his governorship, I think one thing that he was known for is being an aggressive prosecutor. He's a former federal prosecutor from New Jersey, and he may decide that it's within his interest to heavily prosecute FCPA cases, even if it's to go after companies domiciled outside the United States that somehow run afoul of the FCPA, such as perhaps Embraer or, Total, Siemens, you name a company. Mm-hmm. So the Attorney General, I think, will have a strong impact, at least philosophically as well.
Yeah. The next big issue on my radar screen, I've got two more. One is going to be antitrust enforcement. And, I don't know how companies are going to handle this because clearly Donald Trump has come out publicly against some of these very large mergers. The AT&T Time Warner deal, which he flatly said he didn't like. I wonder about other ones, say, such as GE buying Baker Hughes or buying a share of Baker Hughes. Some of these other deals that have come along. Who is going to run his antitrust division at the Justice Department? This is one realm where clearly the populist sentiment goes against the traditional Republican grain, that, we might see a lot of these deals not happen. Or, I don't know. I think that Donald Trump, as usual, has not put a lot of thought into these ideas. What would be his rationale to articulate a new antitrust regime? What's his review of this? The AT&T Time Warner deal, there are plenty of people who would say logically it makes sense and consumers might not like it or employees might not like it, but you can't necessarily stop it. Well, logic doesn't factor into a lot of him. His policies aren't necessarily intellectually cohesive and coherent, and we could find the antitrust division all over the map, and the AT&T Time Warner deal right away. That's one if I were the CEO of AT&T, I'd be sweating bullets about this right now. So that's one. Do you want me to go on to the last one on my list?
Yes.
I think people should step back. Compliance officers should step back and remember the bigger picture of what their bosses are worried about. Above all, their bosses are worried about how do we preserve, maintain, cultivate strong, organic, economic growth, not dependent on M&A deals because the cost of money is so cheap. How do we actually get back to good revenue growth, or how do we preserve it? That is a fundamental reality. That is the prime fact for CEOs and boards, and it runs counter to what Donald Trump is already saying about free trade. I think a lot of what Donald Trump says, his policies unto themselves, may not necessarily sound awful. Some of them, if you want tighter immigration, it's not necessarily the end of the world. It's not beyond the pale. If you want to renegotiate some things or other, but when you take them all together, logically, they do not cohere. You cannot be talking about raising interest rates because allegedly the Fed is in some conspiracy to keep them low, which, regardless, there's no political conspiracy to keep interest rates low. There's an economic conspiracy to, keep Fed rates low because we're desperate for growth. So we have to keep interest rates down. I mean, that's not conspiracy. That's common sense. But, if he's going around saying we want to raise interest rates because that will help older savers who are so politically important to him. At the same time, he's talking about starting a trade war with Mexico and China and Canada. You can't have both those things exist at the same time without severe consequences. So a whole lot of what he wants to do in trade is intellectually incoherent. So that means that a whole lot of people are going to sit around and wait on their hands. And those people waiting on their hands are the compliance officers' bosses. The people listening to this, your bosses are going to have no clue what to do. Right. Tom, you mentioned that you thought the Senate might get rid of the filibuster. I don't think that they will, because using a nuclear option causes a lot of damage. And if Trump fails at his presidency, which I suspect that he might, do you really want to take the filibuster away when that might be the only break what if Trump doesn't seek a second term in 2020, which also I don't think he will. But what if the Democrats do somehow take control back in the future and you've lost the filibuster then? I think that is an extreme measure that nobody will want to do until they see, does his free trade approach, does it actually work? And I don't know if it will or it won't, but you can't even really say what it is. It makes no sense. So there's going to be a whole lot of sitting and waiting, which I suspect will slow economic growth, which will set him off about more conspiracies out there. But there's going to be a whole lot of this that's happening that's going to leave people uncertain what to do. When Obama came into office, you had a rough idea of what he was going to do. When Bush came into office in 2001, you had a rough idea of what he was going to do. Donald Trump doesn't know what he wants to do. He knows what he wants to say at any given moment, but that's not a policy agenda. That's not a regulatory agenda. That's not a framework that you can build a plan for. He just sits around spouting whatever comes off. And there's going to be some real bite there that, like I said in the post I had on radical compliance this morning, the last one was, a lot of what we talked about won't matter for a long time because nobody's going to know if what he's talking about is actually going to work.
Matt, I think we're going to have to dedicate an entire podcast to the incoherence of his various economic messages. So perhaps we could save that for another day.
I think that we will be able to talk about this for many, many days, so that sounds fine with me.
Well, Matt, as always, thank you very much, and double kudos for getting this post out today on your post-election first thoughts, and I will look forward to continuing the conversation.
All right, Tom, thank you.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of Compliance Into the Weeds. I am pleased to announce I have a new podcast out. It is Everything Compliance. It is a roundtable discussion format where I have Matt Kelly joins me along with Mike Volkov, Jay Rosen, and Jonathan Armstrong. We're going to post this Everything Compliance podcast twice a week. It's going to be a bit longer than my normal podcast because I wanted to have a true roundtable discussion So I hope you will both check it out on both my site, fcpacompliancereport.com. Also, it'll be available on iTunes. This is Tom Fox. I'd like to thank you very much for listening to this episode of Compliance Into the Weeds.